Hello, everyone. My name is Naznin Virji-Babul. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Physical Therapy at the University of British Columbia. I'm sorry that you have to get this by a video recording, but we tried the online system and the Wi-Fi just wasn't working very well. So I do apologize for that, but I would love to get feedback, or if you have any questions, my email is just at the bottom of the screen, and I would love to hear from you. So please do send me your questions. I've been studying concussion and sports-related concussion in adolescents for the past 10 years, and I'd like to share some of our recent findings on what we've been seeing in terms of brain structure and function. So why focus on the adolescent period? Well, we know that adolescence is the second period of dynamic and rapid growth when the brain is undergoing major reorganization. Adolescence begins with the onset of puberty around the ages of 10 to 12, and it ends, it's a little bit more difficult to define when it ends, but it's generally agreed to end when the individual has achieved some kind of independence and developed some mature social goals and responsibilities. In our Western societies, this typically occurs around 22 to 25 years of age. So this is a very protracted time of development where there are some major changes that are going on. We know that gray matter volume decreases over time over this development. There's an increase in white matter throughout the late 20s and early 30s, and connectivity tends to increase up until the early 30s. So having a brain injury that's superimposed on this very dynamic period of development has a number of consequences. We see changes in brain structure and function that we see immediately post-injury, within the first week of injury, that seem to last a few months. We don't yet have a lot of information about longitudinal changes, but we know from changes in the adults that there are particular sports that make people more vulnerable, and we do see changes, for instance, in adult football players. How those changes occur over time is something that we have many gaps on. We also know that children and youth take longer to recover than adults, so another aspect of their behavioral change. And adolescents who have a history of concussion also have up to a 3 times risk of getting depression or further neurodegeneration. So understanding these changes and how they're occurring and how they're changing over development is really a critical question, and one that my lab is focused on. In terms of brain structure, we know that, so there are two key challenges that I want to mention. We know that in concussion and in youth concussion in particular, we don't have any objective brain-based tools to make the initial diagnosis of concussion or to gauge its severity. In the sports context, usually how severity and symptoms are assessed are by using the SCAT or sideline assessments. And these don't necessarily, have not really shown to have a good relationship with what's happening in the brain. We also up to now don't have any brain-based biomarkers that can predict the trajectory of recovery or the response to treatment on an individual basis. We have, of course, many studies now showing that at the group level, we do see changes in brain structure and function. So what are some of these changes that we see? In terms of brain structure, this is data from one of the earliest studies that we did in my lab, looking at adolescents between the ages of 14 to 17 years of age, who were seen between 18 to 61 days post their initial injury. And many of these adolescents got their injury either from playing ice hockey, which is very common here in Canada, or playing soccer or rugby. And what we saw was, looking at one of the measures, which is whole brain fractional anisotropy, we saw that the concussed group had a significant increase in the FA in this measure in compared to the healthy controls. So early on, we saw that at a group level, there were changes in brain structure over the whole brain. We then looked more specifically at the areas that were showing the greatest changes by using tract-based spatial statistics analysis. And from that, we saw that there were 3 particular regions that seemed to show the most significant changes. And these were all in the frontal region. So in the genu of the corpus callosum, in the anterior and posterior internal capsule, as well as the anterior corona radiata. So the prefrontal area and the frontal region seem to be particularly vulnerable to damage as a result of concussion that we know now and are seeing more and more as more studies come out on the adolescent group. How are these changes then related to what we see in terms of brain function? So in our study, we took the same group of adolescents who had been concussed and the healthy controls who had done the DTI. And we also collected fMRI, resting state fMRI data. And within this group, what we saw was that there were two networks in particular that showed the biggest changes. That was the default mode network and the executive function network. And in particular, there were three regions that were highly statistically significant in doing the dual regression and looking at some of these changes. The first was that we saw increased connectivity in the posterior cingulate cortex within the default mode network. We also saw increased connectivity in the frontal pole, in the executive function network, and increased activity in the left frontal operculum cortex, which is associated with the ventral attention network. So this data showed that there are significant differences in several resting state networks in adolescents with concussion. And this abnormal increased connectivity within the top-down, especially attention networks, suggested initially that maybe there's an issue with increased distractibility. There have been several recent studies that have observed abnormal activity within resting state networks and have suggested that these changes may be related to increased cognitive fatigue, post-concussion symptoms such as headache or increased distractibility. But to date, we haven't really been able to get a good correlation, a good relationship between what's happening behaviorally and some of these group level statistics that we're seeing, both within the brain structure and function. Now, the vast majority of studies that have looked at resting state fMRI, including our own, have implicitly assumed that temporal stationarity of these intrinsic connectivity networks. However, we know now that this assumption is quite an oversimplification. The intrinsic networks are not stationary, but in fact, they're quite dynamic and switch between different brain states, even within the single scanning session that we often do, which is usually around 8 minutes or so. And the strength as well as the directionality of these connections between the brain regions can vary over very short time scales from within seconds to minutes. And we then went back and looked at some of our fMRI data to try and understand how these brain states within the resting state networks actually shift within a single scanning session. So we conducted a sliding window analysis with shorter time intervals, windows of 30 time points, and looked at the time spent, which we call dwelling time, how often those networks were maintained during that resting state. And what we found, we were able to extract 3 different brain states within this adolescent groups that we had. And the first brain state was active around 26% of the time within all the windows that we had. The second one was active at about 46% of the time, and the third one between 27% of the time. So brain state 2 was the most frequent when we looked at all these 3 brain states. And all of these were characterized by positive coupling between visual networks, and you can see this in the paper if you want to look more closely at this. But there's a positive coupling between visual networks and within auditory networks. In brain state 2 especially, we think this is related to the mind-wandering state of the brain states. What's interesting is that what we found was that there were quite different, or I should just add here that we can actually quantify the amount of time that an individual spends in these different brain states. So for instance, you can see that this subject spent relatively more time in brain state 2 than in brain state 1. So we're actually able to quantify the amount of time that is spent in each of these brain states. And what's really interesting is that what we found was that in the healthy adolescents, who are also athletes, they tended to switch equally between the 3 different brain states. So this black line shows the amount of time, this is their mean dwelling time across the 3 brain states. And they're spending about equal amounts of time in each of these brain states, but they're switching dynamically between these 3. In the concussed group, which is represented by the red line here, you see that the adolescents seem to get stuck in brain state 2, which is, what, as I said previously, more of the mind-wandering state. So they're not able to switch flexibly and dynamically between their internal states and their external states, and they seem to get stuck in one state in particular and not able to get out of that. So we think that this might be this inability for these adolescents with concussion to not be able to switch as quickly and smoothly may actually reflect some kind of lack of dynamic flexibility and may have some relationship with some of the symptoms related to difficulty paying attention or feeling that they're in a fog because they're getting stuck in one brain state. We are now looking more closely at adolescents with concussion using resting state EEG and using graph theory analysis as well as affective connectivity to try and understand a little bit more about the hyperconnectivity that we're seeing. So our group for these next studies that I'm going to be talking about are made up of healthy soccer players who are part of the Whitecaps soccer team, which is a team that is based in BC, and then athletes who have had an acute concussion. And essentially what we do is just collect 5 minutes of eyes closed resting state. And what we've seen here is very similar to what we see in the fMRI data, is that there is a change in local connectivity at 1 week post-concussion. And this is a measure that we use from graph theory, looking at betweenness, which is the amount of connections between different areas of the brain. And we take the sensor data and convert it to source space to look at specific brain regions. And we see that there's hyperconnectivity, especially in the frontal area. So the red bars represent the concussed group and the blue bars represent the control group. So we see greater connectivity in the frontal regions in the concussed group, but also there are other areas, the occipital region being another area that shows greater hyperconnectivity, as well as the left parietal. And these were all the adolescents who were at 1 week post-concussion. What's interesting is that when we then look at the symptoms to see if there's any relationship with the symptoms, there's a lot of variability, both in the number of symptoms as well as their symptom severity. So number of symptoms range between 1 to 22, and here we have an average of about 13. Severity ranges from 1 to 63, and on average we had about 30 in terms of severity across all the entire group. So there's quite a lot of variability. I mean, some of the children who the coach witnessed that they actually had a head impact did not really have a lot of symptoms, and yet we saw that there were changes in the brain. So how can we try and quantify this? Well, first we looked at whether there was any relationship between the symptoms and severity with the frontal connectivity, because that's an area that we generally, both in the fMRI and the DTI and in the EEG, see a lot of changes in these areas. And what we see is that there really is no relationship either with the symptoms or severity, suggesting that symptoms are really probably measuring something very different from what is happening in the brain. And often we tend to correlate these two measures. But I think when we look at the long-term, especially trajectory, we see that symptoms get resolved within a few weeks, but the changes that we see in the brain go on for much longer. And there's now a number of studies that are showing that. So there are changes in relation to reorganization of the brain that may or may not be related to the symptoms, but may need more sensitive measures of changes in behavior or in cognitive function for us to be able to discern these differences. One way that we've been looking at getting some more sensitive information and details about how the brain is actually being reorganized is by looking at affective connectivity. So affective connectivity essentially looks at how information is flowing between different regions of the brain. And again, we converted the sensor space data into source space to look at changes that are happening across the brain. And we applied something called the information flow rate to measure the transfer of information between the time series at different source locations and therefore between different brain regions. So this study had, we included 32 healthy adolescents who were around the age of 16 and 21 concussed adolescents around the age of 15. And all the concussed individuals were within 1 week of injury. And what this slide is showing are the different connections and the strength of those connections. So the red arrows represent the most important connections, the top 5 connections that are most important. And we have ways to quantify and statistically differentiate the most important from the least. So the red arrows are the top 5, and then the next 5 are in yellow, and the next are in green, and then the final, the bottom 15 number of connections are in turquoise. And what you see here is that at a group level, the controls of the top 5 connections, you see that the left frontal region seems to be where a lot of information is flowing from and coming into. So in this plot, you see that the healthy controls are really characterized by activity that is very left-centered. There's not a lot of symmetry that is happening. It's very much left-centered. And as you go across to the different connections, again, you see that most of the connections are within the anterior regions of the brain, although there are some in more of the posterior regions. In contrast, what we see with the adolescents with concussion, they show some very distinct differences in information flow, even at this very early time of just 1 week post-concussion. What we see, first of all, is that now the region of the brain that seems to be at the center of this information flow has shifted from left frontal to actually becoming the frontopolar midline. So the midline frontal regions this region of the brain has now taken on more importance. And you see activity going to both frontal left as well as to frontal right, and activity coming back to the frontal polar midline. So there's a shift. There's more symmetry now in the way the information is flowing. And you can see that across these different plots, that there's more left-right symmetry compared to some of these other plots in the control group. And one other interesting thing that is present in this group that was not present in the control group is that we're now seeing connections going across the 2 hemispheres. So we see connections between frontal left and frontal right, as well as the anterior temporal regions now communicating with each other. And so what we're I think seeing here is that damage to particularly the frontal regions, as I showed in the first slide, seems to result in a rerouting of information through newly established detour pathways. It's like there's been a train wreck, and instead of, the pathways to getting from one place to another has now been obstructed. Different pathways have to be created to get the information to flow between the hemispheres, across hemispheres, and between anterior and posterior, in order to try and reestablish communications between the different regions. So I think this is the first study that has actually reported changes in how information flow is changing after the brain injury. What will be interesting to see is how long we can detect these changes, and particularly how they will relate to function. So just to summarize, the challenges in working with the adolescent population particularly is that we know that the initial experience of the concussion is very variable. The sideline assessment tools are not very specific. A lot of the symptoms that are in those sideline assessments are things that adolescents experience typically anyway without having any brain injuries. And the severity is very subjective. So how do we now relate what we're seeing at a very different level by peeking into the window of the brain to see that there is some reorganization that's happened as a result of the injury? And how do we now relate this back to the function and to behavior and to cognitive functioning is going to be the next challenge. And then to start to document how we can predict recovery based on an individual basis. We are now starting to use some machine learning approaches to try and see if we can find ways from resting state data to actually get information about individual subjects. And I hope to be able to present that at the next Frontiers conference. So just to end, I wanted to thank all my funding sources, especially our community partners who are really very well engaged and really involved and supportive of our work. And of course, all my students and collaborators who do most of this work. So thank you very much.